Hello students, this is the first video lecture for your course on terrorism, and today I'm going to look specifically at chapters 3 and 4 of your textbook and some additional material that is testable material, but it's drawn more from my own research and my own writings. But we'll have a focus on 3 and 4, and I'll touch on a little bit on 1 and 2, but mainly 3 and 4. Let's begin. I'm going to title this initial portion "The Terrorist Mindset." And if you were taking notes on this, basically that's how I've divided by the terrorist mindset. To understand this thoroughly, I think we have to look back in history and two great philosophers who dealt with civil disorder, high rates of violence, sometimes religious tinged violence, but basically the type of violence that was similar to the type of violence we see when we talk about terrorism today. These individuals were Niccolo Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. Now Machiavelli, writing in the 16th century in Italy, chaotic time in their history, various battles between city-states, the use of mercenaries. Machiavelli was a political theorist, but he also was a practitioner. He fought in some of these battles, and what he did was come up with a basic method of operation for somebody who would be able to lead these groups and become a ruler. He wrote a book on this called The Prince, which some of you I'm sure are familiar with, maybe all of you. The Prince is still an important work today, and many people who are involved in revolutionary movements have read and are still reading the book. One of the things that Machiavelli talked about in the book was the idea of using fear, and the fact that people are drawn by their own self-interest. You know, Machiavelli's famous for the quote that better to be feared than loved. He thought that a strong, controlled leader was important, that people would learn to obey, and that you had to be very pragmatic in a violent society. So basically, you know, this idea that Machiavelli also believed that men have inherent weaknesses and are often evil. His end, the end that he thought was to be achieved, was always some form of political power, and the means that you used, any means that would achieve it. Now, our second major philosopher is Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes was, again, writing in the 17th century, and basically, basically Hobbes's ideas dealt with the form of government that control individuals who had in Hobbes' belief, that were driven by self-interest and were inherently prone to a great deal of violence. I think for a terrorism class, it's important to understand that Hobbes was looking at actions that today would be classified as terrorism. The famous Guy Fawkes plot to bomb the Parliament and blow up the King also in England took place when Hobbes was a student at Oxford. So he was very familiar with this, and in that particular case we did have a revolutionary group that was partially motivated by religion and a lot of civil unrest and alienation of individuals who were Catholic living in England, who at the time was ruled by a Protestant king. The Hobbes, I think his main thrust for what we should understand in regard to terrorism was his statement that men commit acts of violence, not just for property and for defense, but also for glory. And by that, Hobbes meant emotions, things that people made us feel good, made us feel powerful. That actually is an expression of one of the factors in the terrorist mindset when we ask, well, why do they do it? Well, Hobbes' phrase, glory, can be translated today for the great deal of emotional satisfaction that they get. because, in fact, there are two basic viewpoints as to why people commit acts of terrorism and join terrorist groups. The basic theory is that they do it because it is a rational choice, it is instrumental, they want to obtain political power, or in maybe other reasons, but political power is, or social control, or huge changes in society. They have these goals, and terrorism is regarded as just a means to an end, and they look at the pluses and the minuses, the costs and the benefits, and there's a choice into how they do it. So you have this rational individuals and single individuals and groups that are goal motivated, and they're doing this for something that is not just purely for emotional pleasure and not driven just by their subconscious emotions. The second the major way that people look at terrorism is precisely Hobbes's idea, the glory concept, the emotional aspect of terrorism. That, in fact, one phrase that's often used is that people become terrorists because their goal is to become a terrorist. Terrorism is the goal. That you get many subconscious, you get subconscious desires that are translated into emotional benefits for you when you commit acts of terrorism. The idea about the terrorist mindset that is most important is the idea of violence, because that is the sine qua non of terrorism. The fact that violence has to be used, or at least the threat of violence is present in individuals' minds, but generally it's going to be used, and the people who engage in terrorism at the actual level of taking action, or sometimes referred to the trigger pullers or the active cadre. These are the individuals that are expected to have the propensity to use violence and the ability to use it in an effective manner. Now, in looking at this, we realize that there has to be a way for human beings who generally, our species generally has some inhibitions towards violence among other members of our species. Oftentimes we have filters that eliminate our basic thoughts as to why we shouldn't do it, our conscience-driven feeling, our sentiments. Wartime, we have orders from our government. In fact, we're carrying out missions for the government. When you're committing an act of terrorism and you're a terrorist group member, you don't have that sanction from society as expressed through the government of a country. So you have to have some other method for some individuals. Some individuals don't need a filter, but most of us need to filter out these feelings that we should not be committing acts of violence against our fellow human beings. And one of the ways we do it, a filter that exists, is our ability to perceive other members of another group as not quite the same as us. And in some cases, the motivations of the group or the pressures of the group, we're able to transform these individuals into the other. And that other can undergo a further transformation into the evil ones, the individuals that are trying to destroy something that we love and cherish, and we're able to demonize other individuals. There's a psychological mechanism that's often talked about in this process called splitting. And Gerald Post in your textbook mentions this several times. And it's basically a form of externalizing blame. You split the feelings that you have about your own problems and your the things that bother you about yourself, and you split them from yourself and put them into other people, and you demonize them. What that means, all the evil things that you may be worried about in yourself, well, these groups are the cause of it, and they become also the term called scapegoating. They become the scapegoats. And scapegoats is the old term, is a term used, derived from the Jewish religion, from the Old Testament. It was the idea that you would take the goat, and the goat would affect all the problems of the tribe would be on the goat, and the goat would be slaughtered. So scapegoating is a saying. We're using these groups as our scapegoat. We're splitting and using them as a scapegoat. The idea of mindset is also based on some other ideas as to whether or not we have certain traits or characteristics that predispose us to be capable or to commit terrorist acts or join terrorist organizations. The variety of experts have looked at this concept. Do we have these predisposing traits? Now, there's basically a consensus, although there are disagreements as to whether or not that we have an actual unique, that individual terrorists have unique psychological flaws that draw them into the orbit of terrorist movements. The consensus is that we don't, that basically terrorists are essentially normal. Now, I'll say some things about that. There's one expert, Frederick Hacker, the late Dr. Frederick Hacker, had what he called Hacker's typology of terrorism. I'm a believer in it. My own experience with a very violent terrorist group, I noticed that very obvious that the members were drawn from three basic categories. You had in Hacker's typology, he talked about the crusader. The crusader is the truly dedicated you could say indoctrinated, but he's the true believer, someone who really believes in the cause. They want to achieve a social or political goal, and they're drawn. And terrorism becomes, to some degree, more of a rational choice because of the overall goal. Now, the crusader again is the classic idea of what people think of as the terrorist. The other category that's of interest is the criminal, and the criminal, in my experience, will always be part of a terrorist group. Certain individuals are drawn to terrorism because of for one, the action that they can experience, the chance for profit, protection of the group that they're involved in, and it gives them a certain cover for their activities. So now, there are drawbacks to terrorism and terrorist groups. In fact, in the major group that I was involved in actually bringing down, we actually made that case based upon an individual terrorist group member who was a criminal. He was using a group, he was selling drugs while he was in the group. He gave the group up. And that's the weakness of bringing criminals into the terrorist group. They really have to be vetted very closely, and they're always risky. But other criminals have actually converted over and changed and become crusaders. So they're there. They're always present in the groups. Now, the third category are the crazies, and I would like to think when I say crazies, someone who is psychotic is not going to be brought into a terrorist group. But individuals, that term really refers mainly to people that are, may have fairly severe personality disorders, or disorders that could be psychotic in some circumstances, but they're much lower on the level of that particular mental infirmity, that it's not to the point where they're suffering from hallucinations or delusions. And this particular trait is paranoia. Many terrorists, are paranoid. And that is often a very valuable or adaptive trait for being a terrorist. So a crazy can sometimes be someone who's successful in the group, sometimes depending upon the degree of of personality disorder, that individual may not be able to be introduced to the group, may be driven out, or may not want to participate. They may be drawn more towards lone wolf activities, operating on their own, or with individuals of similar personalities in small nihilistic type cells. So that typology, very important. I think it's a good typology, which is why I do have a problem when we start looking at individuals in terrorist groups as having this one, even this list of traits that are one group. There's always great variance in terrorist groups, and even Hacker talked about the idea there was no, in his categories, there was no, very few people were pure. You know, there were elements, often elements of the other three types in that one individual. That would be, for example, a Crusader could have paranoid ideas. He also could have been or could be motivated partially by the money he might be able to obtain, even though the major goal or the most important goal was achieving a political objective. So you can see this blend of traits that exist in all of us to some degree in life, and this terrorists are the same. None of us are purely have certain traits that are universal across the society. Now, in regard to what actually, though, starts this process, I would say there is pretty much a consensus that the individual who starts looking to join a terrorist group usually is frustrated with their current life circumstances. And probably the best writer and theorist on this idea of the underlying reasons for joining I think was Eric Hoffer, the late Eric Hoffer, who was a philosopher who specialized and did a great deal of writing about revolutionary movements, communism more than any other movement, but movements in general. Now, Hoffer wrote a very famous book that's still, I think, an invaluable source. It's called The True Believer. And he did think that the frustration that individuals suffered was the first step towards joining some type of revolutionary movement, of which he thought in general people could join just about any type. It was kind of what was available. But frustration started it, and they had to have a desire for change in their life, change in the milieu they were part of. Hoffer also said, and this is very important, about the importance of a group. He believed that if you had this frustration, which he often led to anger, and sometimes criminal acts, this could be captured once you joined a group or became associated with members, that the group itself could develop other characteristics in you that would become very important to being an effective member of that group. And some of these were self-sacrifice. And I'm sure we're aware of that. We realize that terrorism, one of their worst tactics is often some form of suicide attack. Hoffer saw that as a group pressured factor on a frustrated, angry individual. There's a hatred of the present, a hatred of an enemy, and they help with the demonization of the external forces, external people, external groups, the external society from the group. The capacity for violence. Hoffer saw the group as being a very important factor in that. The development of obedience and submission to the group, and the suspicion, the development of suspicion towards outsiders from the group. In regard to how does someone get frustrated, well, and there we should look at another very prominent terrorism researcher and writer, Ted Gurr. Gurr, G-U-R-R, and Gurr talked about deprivation. In fact, Gurr believed that people joined revolutionary movements sometimes because of a form of relative deprivation. They were alienated because they basically perceived the discrepancy between their value expectations, what they expected to get out of society, and their value capabilities, which are larger. By Gurr's phrase, that type of relative deprivation meant that these are individuals who are alienated because they're aware that there's nothing for them to achieve. The things that are in a society for them to achieve, that they can achieve, that they can believe they're going to achieve in their society, that the capabilities, what they really could achieve, are much superior to that. And this alienates them and frustrates them. You see this occurs in many societies, and it has throughout history. The Middle East is very symbolic of this today, this particular type of relative deprivation, where you've got people who are often well educated in some areas of their society, but really the opportunities are no longer present, and it drives them in some cases. Well, you see people well educated and intelligent joining certain jihadi groups, and you wonder why would they do it with that education. They're engineers or medical doctors in some cases, and they're often very well educated. Why would they join a terrorist group? Well, it's this alienation that they've suffered. Hoffer felt that there was Gurr actually believed there was also the same splitting factor. There's this need in people to externalize blame on the existing political and social situations, and this would drive them into political movements, which often ended up resulting in joining terrorist organizations, committing terrorist acts. Another theorist that's important to be aware of is Donna Della Porta. She studied Italian left-wing groups in Italy in the 70s and 80s, and she believed that people became radicalized or joined these groups often because they met other like-minded peers or relatives, friends, and these individuals formed cliques. They were conscious of, they were all frustrated, but now it's reinforced with other people. They often joined social movements together, and while in those social movements, in Italy at the time, they sometimes had violent aspects, street fights, mini riots, not terrorism, but facts where they had to use physical violence and force. So certain individuals became attuned to that. And these cliques often ended up resulting in individuals being reinforced and moving into a variety of different terrorist groups that existed in Italy at the time. They saw violence, these individuals saw violence as a political tool. Well, in my experience, this is often important also, that individuals have a way to meet like-minded individuals that will reinforce their beliefs, and they meet them in a variety of social venues, often called nodes. It's a term we should realize, a node where these individuals kind of intersect. And that could be a lot of things, the coffee houses, today in some cases prisons, the gymnasiums, athletic clubs of different types, outdoor activity groups, discussion groups that might exist. They move into this, and this helps, it sets them on a path, this radicalization pathway. Some of them it doesn't, some branch off, stop, other ones will sometimes progress. Now, to move on to this radicalization pathway, you've got to again develop these filters, these mechanisms to get rid of the inhibitions you might feel towards engaging in violent acts. And a lot of things we do that with, and we got, you basically use different techniques, self-talks, Your own peers will give you reasons for why your feelings about committing violent acts may be justified. If you're, depending on your society, it might be the myths in the society, certain myths and vendettas that exist in society, the stresses between different social groups. These can all be factors you can use to justify feelings and desires to commit a violent act in a terrorist movement, even though your real motivation could be the fact that you really like the thrill of it, and the fact that violence gives you kind of a catharsis when you commit an act of violence, and it has an expressive value to you. When you look at this, and I'm going to call this the radicalization process, there are two basic theoretical approaches to understanding it. One is to say that it starts from a top-down radicalization process. The other one is from a bottom-up approach. The top-down approach has to deal with usually more organized terrorist movements who have the resources and the individuals who are capable of going out and recruiting other members for the terrorist group. They use a selection process, they observe the individuals, they may test them, but they're using a top-down method. And if the video that we showed in class on Algiers and the terrorist movement against the French, you saw the protagonist being recruited by the leader of the terrorist group. He was being recruited from a top-down method. He would have continued as a criminal if he hadn't been recruited very effectively by this leader. Now, the other approach, Al-Qaeda has traditionally used that method, using recruiters in the earlier stages of their organization. The other approach, the bottom-up approach, is of great interest today because that's what we're seeing. As Al-Qaeda has lost some of their force and vigor in the overall terrorist milieu throughout the world, what you still see, and they still have a role in some ways, but what you still see more of this self-generated type of terrorism, which people often refer to as homegrown terrorism. And this is a bottom-up approach. And that means someone is actually capable of self-generating radical ideas. And they do this through the external nodes and methodologies that are available to people in today's society throughout the world. And by that I mean predominantly the internet. Now, think back, when I'm talking about this radicalization process, specifically this bottom-up, that's existed as long as terrorism existed. It's just that the process was a little more difficult, but it was still that the anarchists had a very effective bottom-up process. And they also used top-down, but they also had bottom-up. Now, this bottom-up process is something that can be used and is seen quite widely today in these small groups that don't, and often crush pretty quickly, because there are ways to identify. Law enforcement has methods to identify how people might be becoming radicalized by monitoring their activities. But it is important to understand these two basic processes. So that's going to end this. Dan wanted to listen to the lecture, my dog, but I'll finish up on another tape. And I'll be seeing you there and on that tape, and we'll get you prepared here for your exam on Thursday. Thank you. Oh, you bum.